Unitarian Universalist congregations affirm and promote 7 principles, which we hold as strong values and moral guides. An example of a principle is the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We live out these principles within a living tradition of wisdom and spirituality, and they're drawn from sources as diverse as science, poetry, scripture, and of course, personal experience. For the past several weeks, we've been focusing on these sources, and there are 6 stated, appropriately called 6 sources of living traditions. The first 3 were, and I've abbreviated, direct experiences of mystery and wonder, words and deeds of prophetic people, and wisdom from the world's religions. This is our 4th week. And as such, the 4th source, which is as follows. Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And I wanted to ask what your first reaction to that might be. I'll read it again in case you weren't paying attention. Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. I'd like to offer a few things that came to my mind. 4, actually, when reading the 4th source. Kind of 4 on 4th source thing. Number 1, it was a bit of disappointment. I thought, it's just the golden rule. How did I get worship associate duties? Just talking about the lousy golden rule. Boring. I wanted to talk about something controversial, maybe edgy, like unicorns or something. Number 2, after getting over that and letting it steep for a bit, I gave it some additional thought and pondered really about the golden rule. The first thought that came to mind is the way that I treat myself, is that really the best model of how I should treat others? Number 3, wait a second. Are you saying the golden rule is a Jewish or a Christian invention? Come on. I see this like on the back of cereal boxes. I see it on inspirational stickers and perfumey houses. It's everywhere. Playground equipment, it's even taught in public schools. Everyone knows that you should love your neighbors as yourselves. I think it's a little condescending of Christianity or Judaism to claim the golden rule. Number 4, isn't Unitarian Universalism a little beyond Christianity or Judaism? Why are these 2 get so lucky that it'd be called out exclusively as a source? I had a number 5, but then I couldn't call it 4 on 4th source. I did my best to give this some open thought, and I really reread it a few times. Then I tried to Google the official golden rule. Even typed in goldenrule.com, it doesn't exist. And though I couldn't find the actual trademarked version, I started to feel like I jumped to an unfair conclusion. You see, the 4th source is stated a little bit different than most versions that I found of the golden rule. And the subtle difference really seems quite significant. Often the golden rule says, treat unto others as you'd like to be treated. Or a little different version, do unto others as you do unto yourself. And both are a bit different than love your neighbor as yourself. To me, for one, treating others as you'd like to be treated kind of opens the door up to being a jerk. If you're convinced that you don't mind jerks, or if you're not one to soak in bubble baths, give yourself hugs, or like cozy sweaters from time to time, you may not treat yourself all that nicely, and your own self-love may not be the best yardstick for one's morality. Also, the traditional golden rule expression enforces separation between yourself and your neighbor. Me over here, you guys over there. Comparatively, as the source says, loving your neighbor as yourself blurs that line quite significantly. It's not just like yourself, as in the same way, but rather as yourself, which begins to shift the notion quite a bit differently. And your neighbor and you are the same. And I don't mean like look the same, but are the same. There isn't separation. And I feel that in that oneness, there's a new flood of perspectives, a solid bridge of love, and understanding, of innocence, uninhibited communication, and honesty. This, I think, is loving your neighbor as yourself. I feel that's Christianity. It's not how I learned Christianity. It didn't teach me oneness with others or oneness with God. I was taught very distinct, bold lines between myself and others, and God and myself and Jesus. I mean, even God, who encompasses everything in me, not of me, had his own three parts. Sort of the same, but separate. It's in the creed. So again, why can't Christian traditions be a source to Unitarian Universalism, which like accepts unicorns? I sort of lost track of the 4 on 4th, I realized, but now I'm left with more questions and a bit of an appetite to think more, and I hope that you're in the same place. So come, let us listen.
There is a story about a young child and their father, and they would have a date every Saturday. And they would sometimes go out to eat, and they had saved all their money and would choose what to spend their money on after they went out to eat. Well, in the past, they spent their money on some marbles, which got lost. We've all lost our marbles sometimes, right? And they spent their money on a kite, which sadly got all tangled up and ripped. So they wanted to think a little bit more about how to spend their money this time. But when they were asked what to eat for dinner, that was easy. Pizza. Anybody here like pizza? Yes, one of my favorite foods. Could eat it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, right? Okay. So they went to go to this pizza place, and there they are in their purple sweater, smelling the pizza as they're waiting in this very long line. And I don't know if you've ever been in a very long line, and I'm one of those people who don't happen to know a stranger. And so they started to talk to the child in the red sweater next to them and found out they had a lot of things in common. And as they got in, they went into the pizza parlor to get their pizza. They noticed all of these bright, beautiful sticky notes on the wall. And when they got up to the register to pay, the child in front of them and their parent said, "Grab 2 of the sticky notes for us." And they paid for their pizza with sticky notes. Have you ever paid for your pizza with sticky notes? No. Well, this was a really cool thing that was happening in this pizza place, where if you wanted, you could buy pieces of pizza for the future, for other people to use who may not have money to pay for their pizza. And that's what all of those beautiful notes up there are. And so they grabbed 2 slices down, or 2 sticky notes down to pay for their 2 slices of pizza. And as they continued to talk, this child and their parent and this child and their parent realized how much they had in common and started to be friends. And they went to the playground after, and they played after having their pizza. And then the idea came to them about how they would spend their $5 they had saved up. They decorated 5 sticky notes to put on the wall and add at the pizza place for other kids and parents who wanted to enjoy pizza. And they considered this a mitzvah, a good deed. That's what mitzvah means. And so that is how you have mitzvah pizza. Now, you should know that, Marty, can you bring me one forward? Okay. It is based on a real place. Sadly, this place is no longer open. They just closed during the pandemic. But it is based on a place called Rose's Pizza in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as you can see, look at all of those sticky notes that were lining the walls. Every place you could see, there was Mitzvah pizza. And so I encourage you to think about how you might save your money, how you might offer acts of kindness, how you might do little good deeds wherever you go in the world.
God is not hiding in a temple. The Torah came to tell inattentive people, you are not alone. You live constantly in a holy neighborhood. Remember, love thy neighbor, God, as thyself. We are not asked to abandon life and say farewell to this world, but to keep the spark within aflame and to suffer God's light to reflect in our face. Let our greed not rise like a barrier to this neighborhood. God is waiting on every road that leads from intention to action, from desire to satisfaction.
Obscure, the unpromised land now and again unshrouds itself, each time offering wisps and clues, though hardly an invitation. First, that is no garden hung south of frost and invasion or any such fiction. It is earth, needing terraces, ditches, wells, the stooping back's day-long persuasion. The people are like ourselves, only they are already there. They carry things in hand, an old jug, a basket with leather handles, objects flawed and defined by use. They walk almost everywhere. They can name weeds, birds, stones. They have watched human death. Their women grow old proudly. Their work is hard, so they sleep soundly. How easy to argue for, how difficult to undertake. Everything trails us, catches at our sleeves, not least wariness of ourselves, of the Quixote writing in our minds. Someone said bitterly of the Champ de Pou, French. Whatever's done there must be done on weekends. Well, darling, shops and banks are closing. The risks are dozing. Shall we stay or go? Let's begin with a little pop quiz. Don't worry, it's an open book test. Did you forget your book? Well, you are in luck. Your life is the test, and you've been planning for this day for many years. Okay, let us begin. So, how many of you here this morning or online grew up attending some type of religious community? Okay. Great, almost all. Those who were not a part of any type of religious community growing up. Okay, so also a few. Okay, you can put your hands down. So of you who raised your hand of growing up in a religious community, how many of you would say that you were raised in either a Jewish or a Christian community? Okay, you can put your hands down. And how many of you who raised your hand earlier were a part of some other type of religious community? Buddhist or, okay, great. Okay, the pop quiz is over. You can put your hands down. So I would say about 9 out of 10, if not a little more, were raised religious. And of those, about 9 or a little bit more out of 10 were raised in either a Jewish or a Christian community for those who were raised religious. So after tallying up all the scores, you all pass. Flying colors, A+, great work, everybody. But stay on your toes, okay? Because there might be a couple extra questions later in this sermon. I wanted to begin with a little check-in, a little pop quiz regarding the makeup of our congregation's religious and non-religious upbringing, because it will be, I think, especially useful for our service today. Unless you were born and raised in this congregation or another Unitarian Universalist congregation, you came to UUCCI at some point from either another religious tradition or a secular background. And because of that vast majority of us, as the quiz just indicated, that were raised in either a Jewish or a Christian community, this particular Sunday morning service may be both particularly relevant and challenging to engage at the same time. Today, we have gathered on the fourth Sunday of a 6-part series on the sources of Unitarian Universalism. And the source we are exploring this morning is that as UUs, we draw from, quote, Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. This morning, we are exploring a source that speaks to, perhaps more than the others, a part of our religious past. As such, I hope we are able to glean some knowledge and practical tools for navigating our complex relationships with these traditions as a part of our continued growth as individuals at UUCCI today. I say that our relationships may be complex for 2 reasons with Judaism and Christianity, complex for 2 reasons. The first has to do with the fact that for many of us, not all, but many no longer identify with the tradition of our childhood or adolescence or young adult years. Some of you may, but from my conversations with you, most of you do not. One critical exception may be that for many Jewish individuals, Judaism can be both a cultural and a religious identity. So even if one is no longer religiously Jewish, they may maintain a Jewish cultural identity. And you might be able to argue the same for those who are no longer Christian, but I digress. Regardless, as a result of exploring Unitarian Universalism now as a pathway in life, you may have moved away from your childhood religious identity. This transformation may happen for many reasons, such as the freedom you may have gained to explore other religions than what your parents or family practiced or approved of when you were a child, or the tension you might have with that disagreements of certain teachings of your childhood tradition, or you may have moved away from your previous religious affiliation due to difficult experiences you may have had in that particular religion. In transitioning to Unitarian Universalism, or Unitarian Universalist congregation, you may feel like you either want to leave behind your religious past, or you may feel you have to let go of the tradition of your childhood to be a UU. The latter is of particular concern, and the former is of secondary concern. Let me explain. Our fourth source, if anything, affirms that you need not let go of the teachings of these 2 traditions, especially as they relate to the themes of love and service and the neighbor or stranger in your lives. You do not have to shed your religious identity like a snake skin before coming through these doors. And the secondary concern regarding a desire or a want one might feel to leave behind your past religious identity, I believe emerges from a very human desire to, as the saying goes, throw the baby out with the bathwater. That if you don't agree 100% with the religious teachings of your childhood, then it is likely there is little to nothing that you would agree with or derive meaning from later in adulthood. And don't get me wrong, there are huge reasons to move away from the religious teachings or experiences of your past, including those of sexism and homophobia and racism, and about God and human nature and the afterlife. These teachings and experiences can be anything on the spectrum of irritating or frustrating to traumatic and harmful. By this fourth source, however, you do not have to leave it all behind to become a UU. In other words, modern Unitarian Universalism is neither inherently Jewish or Christian, nor is Unitarian Universalism inherently anti-Christian or anti-Jewish. In fact, the fourth source of our living tradition begs the opposite, that indeed there is possible meaning, truth, and guidance still to be derived from the teachings of both Judaism and Christianity. That may have been a lot to follow, but it is important to name these nuances because the fact of the matter is these two traditions, Judaism and Christianity, have been pulled out, as Kevin said, pulled out of the third source, which, if you recall, last Sunday was about the world's religions. Judaism and Christianity are part of the world's religions, but they've been pulled out as holding particular collective importance for our living tradition. And thus, we are spending a little more time in this series to engage them. I mentioned earlier that our relationships with Jewish and Christian teachings may be complex for two reasons, and I only shared one. The second reason is that each of our experiences and comfort levels with Jewish and Christian teachings are going to likely fall more prominently on one tradition or the other. So, for example, if you were raised Christian, this doesn't mean you necessarily are familiar with the teachings and experiences of Judaism. And if you were raised Jewish, you don't necessarily have a particular understanding of the teachings or experiences of Christians. And while the two traditions do have an intimate and complicated relationship with one another, they also have very different transformations over the past several millennia. But they are both named in the fourth source equally. They are both top-billed co-stars of our fourth Unitarian Universalist source. But I'd expect in this room of those of you who were raised in a Jewish or Christian upbringing, the vast majority of you would raise your hand as being raised Christian rather than Jewish. If you answered earlier that you were raised in a Jewish or Christian community growing up, I invite you to raise your hands again. And then keep your hand up if that tradition was Judaism. You can put your hands down. And so why is that? Well, here are a few thoughts. I believe that our fourth source is a work in progress, just as we are all a work in progress. You see, our sources have changed over time, both the language and wording, but also the emphasis and what is noticeably centered or absent in them. You may have been curious about this the past couple weeks. You may have thought to yourself, how did these become our sources? When did they become our sources? Were they always written exactly like this? Well, this particular source used to be written a bit differently, and actually was sort of a combination with our second source, which we talked a little while ago about prophetic people. But listen, if you can, sense one major difference to the 1960 version of this source, 62 years ago. Quote, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. Whew. Man, 62 years ago, we've changed a little bit in those days, but the phrase that is of particular importance, did you hear it? Judeo-Christian heritage. Set aside heritage for a second. Have you heard that term before? Judeo-Christian? While it is a common term for many, it's actually a pretty controversial and problematic term because it has a complicated history about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. This is because it harkens to something known as supersessionism. You heard that term? Supersessionism. It is the belief that Christianity represented a new covenant with God, a new tradition that was to supersede the traditions of Judaism. This can be seen in very horrific examples of anti-Semitism, including the Holocaust and violence across this country and world. And it can be seen in more subtle situations, like calling the Jewish scriptures the Old Testament and the Christian scriptures the New Testament. Stephen Feldman, reflecting on pre-World War II European sentiments on this topic, writes, for Christians, the concept of the Judeo-Christian tradition comfortably suggests that Judaism progresses into Christianity, that Judaism is somehow completed in Christianity. Christianity, according to this belief, reforms and replaces Judaism. The belief, therefore, implies, first, that Judaism needs reformation and replacement, and second, that modern Judaism remains merely as a relic. Most importantly, he writes, the belief of the Judeo-Christian tradition insidiously obscures the real and significant differences between Judaism and Christianity. So, when the source refers or referred back in the day to the Judeo-Christian heritage, this heritage is a fraught one, a harmful one, indeed a deadly one. Additionally, it sort of prioritizes, elevates, and makes supreme this heritage, as Kevin suggested, over the other universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every other age and tradition. Now, I feel all of this background is necessary. I hope you see that. Because before we can get to the Jewish and Christian teachings themselves, we need to unpack why these traditions are called out from the rest of the world's religions. And we need to understand how the history of affirming the Judeo-Christian heritage complicates our relationships now with them both, of Judaism and Christianity. At this point, you might share Kevin's impulse and perhaps his earnest wondering, his fourth comment, 4 on 4. That was good. That was good. His impulse to sort of, to leave it all behind. Perhaps that Unitarian Universalism has or should move beyond Judaism and Christianity altogether. Well, this brings us back to that idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But if you think deeply about this, in light of what we just unpacked together, we might see the possible trap we run into if we go that route. Can you think of it? That's right, supersessionism. We risk continuing a belief of a regular, linear, singular direction of human thought and action and value that leads us to conclude that Unitarian Universalism is merely the next iteration, the natural continuation, the matured evolution of these traditions. Isn't Unitarian Universalism beyond Judaism and Christianity? Well, my friends, if you are wondering what my opinion on the answer to this is no. But more importantly, to that binary, that yes or no question, as if on a pop quiz of any significance, is another question, or rather an invitation. You see, but I believe some of the deepest wisdom and teachings of both Judaism and Christianity is found in how it invites, these traditions invite us to imagine a new way of being in relationship with the world around us. It invites us to question how we love and with whom we share this love. It invites us to consider who is within and who is beyond our circle of care and concern. It asks us to consider where love is manifest, where beauty and the sacred reside, and how we might approach it with a desire to embrace them in their mystery with wonder and care. You see, I believe that the teachings of Judaism and Christianity, and also of this fourth source of Unitarian Universalism, are ultimately invitations to get out of the bathtub, come out of the temple, the congregation, the church, and to re-enter the neighborhood of our precious lives on this earth. We are called to remember, as the late rabbi and civil rights activist Abraham Joshua Hoschel writes, we are not alone. We live constantly in a holy neighborhood. Remember, love thy neighbor, God, as thyself. What a radical notion, to love your neighbor, that is God, as yourself. Love your neighbor beyond the beliefs or differences you may have with them, beyond the gated communities we may have erected, beyond the excuses to stay in, the distractions to look down, and the desire sometimes to just keep our eyes shut. My friends, we have an opportunity to open our eyes and look up and out upon this world with an ethic of care and an understanding of neighbor that draws us closer to one another and forward to something we did not know was even possible, a world obscured as it may be, unpromised, unfulfilled, shrouded as it may be, a world that is of this world, to be tended on this earth, in this life, with the tools in hand. And hand in hand, a people walking and working, growing and resting, arguing, perhaps, and also undertaking this wild life we share together, knowing more is possible. More love, a love beyond belief that leaves us within an ultimate and final and tender question for each of us: shall we stay or go? Shall we stay or go? Rumi responds nearly a millennia before Adrienne Rich could utter the final question on this morning's quiz. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. I will meet you there. And that love and that neighborhood that we will build indeed will be worth the journey. May we go. Amen.